You're listening to Big World Network.
Skyfire, Episode 2, written and read by Arthur W. Johnson. With his cap pulled tight, Seamus made a dash for the ladder, but it seemed to move sideways and he was slammed against the bulkhead. He no longer trusted his legs, so he crawled to the base of the ladder. As he climbed, he felt as he had when he was a boy, and the wind blew the trees as he neared the tops. It was exhilarating and frightening at the same time. The ladder swayed to and fro at an alarming speed. He reached the top and crawled out onto the deck, tasting the salty spray as it blew in his face. He reached the capstan and got a firm grip before the briny waves again broke over the railing, engulfing him, and all went momentarily black. As the wave receded, he heard a shout along the deck. It was Kyle's voice yelling in the stormy night, "I can't hold!" Seamus crawled and rolled in the direction of the voice and found him feet down, hanging through the balusters, with his elbows jammed between the neighboring balusters to anchor himself. The receding wave had washed him overboard, but luck had provided him with a last purchase on life. Seamus took the loose end of the dangling shroud line and stripped the lanyard off the lower end of the deadeye. He looped it under Kyle's arm and back through the upper deadeye, tying it firmly before the next wave broke, and he had to find something firm to grab onto. As the deluge subsided, he looked to where Kyle had been, and during a flash of lightning saw a void. The railing flipped and bobbed on a passing wave, and Kyle was not to be seen. He heard the captain shout commands from the helm, but he did not respond. Kyle was missing, and that was all he could think about. But the shroud line had held, and in another lightning flash he saw Kyle's limp body sway away from the hull as the ship listed. He imagined that he heard a crash against the hull as the next wave pitched the ship the other way. Quickly he located a boat hook and crawled to the edge of the deck where, after several tries, he was able to snag the taut line that held his new friend. With all the strength he could muster, he dragged Kyle's inert body onto the deck and pulled him over to the base of the mast, where he lashed him securely before racing to the helm ahead of the next breaking wave. He felt he was starting to understand the rhythms of the sea. "Tie yourself down, lad," Captain Fowler bellowed above the roar of the sea. Before Seamus could respond, he felt himself being tugged across the slippery deck by a salty hand. What worried him most was the feeling of falling. He kept expecting the splash as he hit the waves, but was surprised by the painful crunch as he slammed onto something hard. As another bolt of lightning streaked the sky, he looked up and saw the square opening of the hatch above his head. He said a silent prayer of thanks for forgetting to close the cover on his first trip up the ladder. Now he would have to do it again, but at least he was alive to make the climb. Halfway up, he looked back during another lightning flash and spotted the rope, no longer in a neat coil. He went back down and tied the loose end around his waist, then dug the other end out from under the heap and dragged it up to tie to the top rung of the ladder. He looked aloft, and lines from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner went through his mind. With sloping mast and dipping prow. Odd to think of poetry at a time such as this, he thought, but then I wonder who killed the albatross. A chill possessed him as his mind flew back to Mayfield Manor, and he said to himself, "I did. But this ghost is supposed to be gone." He set his jaw and crawled onto the deck with resolve. The deck heaved and dropped and pitched to port as he slid the cover into place. He would weather this storm, and so would the ship. The masts groaned in agreement, and he made his way to the helm. The leech lines and the halyards sang under the strain as the wind and waves roared around the ship, and the last stanza came to mind. "And he went like one that hath been stunned, and is of sense forlorn. A sadder and a wiser man, he rose the morrow morn." Such a sad and lonely epic, he thought, but what else could Samuel Coleridge be expected to write with all that opium influencing his mind? "I shall write cheerful poetry to counter all the grays and blacks of this life." Just as with the ancient mariner, when he began to see the beauty of life, it began to improve. The gale winds weakened from a shriek to a low howl, and the mountainous waves contented themselves to buffet the ship rather than bury it. He stooped to pick up a small creature lying at his feet. It made a rippling sound of popping noises as the cups on its many arms lost their suction on the smooth teak deck. It writhed in his hand as he carried it to the edge of the deck and dropped it to its life. Seamus made his way to the base of the mast with a warm feeling growing in his breast. Kyle grinned up at him and said, "Am I a prisoner, or will you untie me now?" "Are you fit to stand against the pitching yet?" he asked. "Ha! I can stand against anything," Kyle said. Seamus smiled down at his friend, himself a sadder but a wiser man. He was amused by Kyle's bold front. "Do you remember the railing that you were holding on to?" When Kyle nodded, Seamus pointed at the empty space where the rail had been. He saw horror cross Kyle's face at the thought of what could have been. "But how—" Kyle stammered. "Everything went black. How did I get here?" "I'll tell you about it later," he said as he untied the lashings. "Right now, Captain Fowler needs our help." As they approached him, Captain Fowler pointed at the hatch and yelled over the wailing wind, "See that the bilge pumps are being manned." Seamus slid the cover back and Kyle stepped down onto the polished ladder. He slipped his feet to the sides of the rail and slid down, bouncing on his toes on the deck below. Seamus smiled at the way he did that and decided that if he were to become a seasoned seaman by the end of this voyage, he had better learn to do it as well. He started out right, but somehow when he reached the bottom, his posterior hit the deck and he rolled over backward. Kyle slapped his thigh and laughed. "It takes practice." He laughed again and raced off in the direction of the pumps with Seamus close on his heels. They found a lone seaman standing by the pump with one hand resting on the lever. He looked exhausted as they approached. They knew him as Mickey O'Rourke. "It's jammed," he said. "Norris has gone below to see what's in it." Kyle gave a shudder, and Seamus knew why. Below was barely high enough for a man to crawl through, since the lower deck had been added to provide a flat place to store cargo. It was best known as the rat deck for the population that inhabited it. Kyle yelled down through the narrow opening, "You all right down there, Norris?" "Aye, it's one of them furry fellas that sucked part way up the pipe. I'll have him out in a shake, I will." Norris splashed his way back through the foot of water and flung the soggy carcass onto the deck, causing Kyle to jump back as it slid against his foot. "There's naught to worry about, lad," said the bearded Norris as he poked his head up through the hatch. "He's drowned now." He clambered out and slid the cover into place to keep the beady-eyed population following. Then he added, "But there's plenty more down there that ain't. They're swimming around and grabbing onto whatever they can." He looked at the others and added with a shudder, "Including me." Seamus also shuddered at the thought. "Let's get the pump going again, Seamus," Kyle said. The two of them relieved the original pumpers as the two tired men slid down the bulkhead to rest. Kyle added, "The worst of the blow is over, lads. Soon it will be clear sailing again." As they worked the pump handles up and down, Seamus, at Kyle's urging, told the tale of how Kyle had been washed overboard and rescued. Seamus was proud of his courage, but he tried to sound humble as he told the story. "Now there's a handy lad to have around," Kyle said to the two resting seamen. "I'm grateful to the captain for bringing him aboard." After a while the pump began to wheeze. "That's it, then. She's sucking air now." The four tired men walked slowly back to the hatch, not noticing how little the deck was moving. Seamus was the first to emerge on deck to the glorious sight of the sky aflame above the western horizon. Seamus thought again of Father O'Connor. "Westward, bound below the coast of Iceland's southern end we sailed. The night was brief as we bore on, with breeze from stern that never failed." Seamus sat on the railing near the bow, where he spent most of his free time searching for the future. He had written those lines to keep his promise of writing cheerful poetry. He stared to the west, where the sun had only set a few hours earlier, and was amazed that the sky had never grown dark. It was nearly daybreak as he continued to stare west before writing. "And yet the sky in bright red flame to west, where sun has long since gone. The sun now rises to the east, what spark it left to greet the dawn." He was interrupted as Captain Fowler looked over his shoulder and asked, "What are you writing, lad?" He felt his face warm with the blush as he answered, "A few lines of verse, Captain." "That's noble. It's not often we have a man of letters aboard. What university did you attend?" "I'm no man of letters," Seamus admitted, half turning. "My village priest, God rest his soul, taught me all I know." "He died then?" "He was killed by—" Seamus stopped. He felt the anger growing within him, and the facts were coming dangerously near the surface. Kyle had told him that the captain liked to get close to the members of his crew, but that was one secret he would not learn. He changed the subject, referring to the last stanza he had written. "Why, with the sun rising in the east, is the sunset still visible in the west?" "'Tis not the sunset you see," he replied, laying a fatherly hand on his shoulder. "That, my young friend, is the birth of new lands." His voice had a dreamy quality that sent a shiver up Seamus's spine. He looked into the captain's steady brown eyes for a clue of the meaning of the words. "This is one of the most unique places on the face of the earth," Captain Fowler continued, "where fire and ice exist side by side. Volcanoes and steam holes come right up through the glaciers. I can never resist spending an extra day or two here." Waving an arm to encompass the whole ship, he added, "Though this trip we may be here even longer to make a few repairs." Seamus said, "I've heard of volcanoes, but I've never seen one. Will we go near enough for a good look?" "Aye, they're all over the mainland of Iceland, but what you see ahead is a chain of small islands called the Westmans. They're forming out in the ocean. We should be close enough for a good look in a few hours." He patted Seamus' shoulder and added, "Then you'll really have something to write about." He swaggered away, leaving Seamus to his solitude and thoughts. The birth of new lands, he thought. Seamus had always thought of volcanoes as a destructive force, yet the captain had called it a birth. He wondered how such a phenomenon could be both, considering what he had read about whole cities being buried under lava and ash. That was death. How could there also be birth in such a thing? As the sun rose from the sea, the light played on strange patterns across the distant cliffs that made up the south coast of Iceland. Seamus marveled at the unusual and sometimes grotesque shapes formed by the alternating shadow and lighted areas. He could easily understand how the Norsemen, with their lack of education, saw the gods and demons lurking among the pitted portals where the sea and the land battled for dominance. As the sun spread its warmth across Seamus' back, he watched a gannet with its wide-spread wings reel and plummet rapidly to disappear beneath the waves with hardly a splash. He watched the spot for a moment, only to be surprised by the gannet's reappearance some 20 feet away. It broke water and soared into the air in a single motion with a fish in its beak. He watched as it grew smaller and blended with the sky on a course set for the coast. He looked over toward the Westmans and saw the columns of smoke and steam billowing high above the islands. It looked like thousands of downy pillows piled high above the sea, ready to topple at any moment. As though in answer to his thoughts, he felt a rumble growing up through the ship into the soles of his feet as the deck quaked beneath him. The vision of the Norsemen again crossed his mind, Norsemen trembling in fear of the monster growling within the bowels of the earth. The downy pile was surmounted by more billowing pillows, seemingly tossed up from within the heap. The rumble had brought the captain back to the bow for another look. "You should be able to see the eruption soon," he said. "That's just the steam and smoke. The real excitement is the huge chunks of rocks that come flying out of the mountain top and the fiery sparks that spread over the land." Seamus looked at the captain for a moment, taking notice of the excitement in his face. He seemed more like a child with a new discovery than a manager of a ship. For the first time since they weighed anchor, Seamus saw the captain to be only in his early 30s rather than an aged and wizened sea captain. The dark hair in front of his ears ran to the bottom of his round chin before pointing the way up through its cleft to his lower lip. The mustaches stopped before rejoining the side whiskers. Brown eyes peered at the billowing steam with a sense of adventure from beneath dark brows that were striving to become bushy. His eyes belied the appearance given by his leathery cheeks, brown and weathered by countless years exposed to punishing salt spray and reflected sunlight. Seamus realized that no matter how abused the exterior became, youthful joys could be locked safely inside, to be brought out and cherished from time to time. He decided that he liked Captain Fowler, even though he ran an illegal ship. A jolly pop on his back took him by surprise as Kyle's voice boomed in his ear. "Well, lad, what do you think of that?" He looked around to find that the entire ship's company was at the rails. Although they had been this way before, they gaped as if seeing the spectacle for the first time. It was an awe-inspiring sight, impossible to ignore, even if it were an everyday occurrence. "It's something different, all right," Seamus said, as if... He stopped and waited for the words to finish forming in his mind before writing more of the poem. "And God breathed again into the morning sky a huger vapor plume than made by you or I. Even the birds in awe ceased to fly, fearing lest he hear their hungry screech and cry." "As if what?" Kyle asked, peering over his shoulder. "I can't read, you know." After Seamus read him the lines he had just written, Kyle glanced up at the sky and said, "I hadn't realized the birds weren't there. You seem to notice everything, don't you?" Seamus shrugged. He didn't think it unusual to notice such details. Captain Fowler turned to them and said, "What's more unusual is that he should see the steam from the volcano as the breath of God." He eyed Seamus for a moment and then asked, "Have you heard of Surtur, lad?" Seamus thought for a moment before replying, "No, I don't believe I have." The captain turned back toward the plume and leaned on the railing, a thoughtful look coming over his face. "There is Surtur," he said, tilting his head toward the eruption. "The Norsemen called him that. I've done a bit of reading myself," he said, glancing at Seamus. "In a story called Ragnarok World Doom, it states, Surtur rides first, and both before and behind him flames burning fire. His sword outshines the sun itself. The Norsemen believe that he was both first cause and world destroyer." Kyle shook his head, signifying that he didn't understand. Seamus's eyes lit up as the significance came clear to him. "Sure," he said, "first cause being the building of an island, and world destroyer would refer to incidents such as the destruction of cities like Pompeii." "Aye," the captain said. He looked again at Seamus curiously. "You are well read then, aren't you?" Kyle stood silently by for a moment, then turned and walked away, saying, "I don't understand any of this." Seamus watched him go as a parent would a child who was upset with himself over some inadequacy. He felt that he needed to take him under his wing and help him over this little upset. When he turned back to the captain, he realized that he also had been under scrutiny. He wondered what tales his own eyes had told as he diverted them to the paper in his hand. "I know how you're feeling, lad. I've been that route myself. My own brother refused his schooling and missed out on so much. I tried to explain how he could see the world from an armchair, but he wouldn't listen. He's a Thatcher in County Cork, and a good one too, but he'll never leave Cork by travel or by reading." "I've got to help Kyle, though," Seamus said, "and I think I know how to get his attention. You see, he wants to one day own his own..." The ocean suddenly came alive with the explosive force of Surtur's wrath. The waves danced and leapt as they had not done before, and the deck vibrated as though Surtur had laid hands on the ship and shook it violently. Every man on deck had clasped hands over his ears to protect them from Surtur's bellow. As it softened to a rumble, the captain yelled to the crew to brace for a tidal wave and raced to the helm.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.
You're listening to Big World Network.